Welcome back to the historic Hotel Orloff. It's a wonderful Wednesday, July 5th, 2023, in the year of our Lord. And last episode was rudely interrupted, but that's all right. We've got the Big Lou back in place, and Great Garloo and Superman all together. We last episode we got some batteries and tried to test them to see if they work. And I discovered one of the bulbs is apparently out in Garloo's head. But once again, we've got Big Lou, Garloo, Superman, and rock and roll. Let's remember that old commercial for Chevrolet. They always run it in the summer. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Right. Well, now, here in the Hotel Orloff, it's Big Lou, Garloo, Superman, and rock and roll. Big Lou, Garloo, Superman, and rock and roll. That sums up a whole philosophical way of looking at life, ladies and gentlemen. Big Lou, Garloo, Superman, and rock and roll. Rock and roll, ladies and gentlemen. Some kid back in the 1950s awakened on Christmas morning to receive this drum set from Santa. Perhaps under this very Christmas tree that we put up yesterday, because July 5th is the traditional start of the Christmas season here in the Hotel Orloff. And so, we're having just a fantastic day here. How was your wonderful Wednesday? There's not going to be a four-color fossils tonight because Graphic Man is in the Ukraine brokering a peace deal. So, he has a rerun, though, up of episode from about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, where the fossils look at comic books with covers that depict dragons, dinosaurs, and assorted reptiles. So you might enjoy that if you go over to the Graphic Man channel. I thought he was going to premiere it right at 7, but it's been up all day, pretty much. So go watch that. You may not have seen it the first time around, but now you can see it, and it's in full color. Full color, 4-color fossil show. Okay, so my goodness gracious. Kids in the 1950s discovered monsters all about the same time because Universal Pictures released a big chunk of their monster movies from the 30s and 40s to television, all in a syndication package. So it was called Shock Theater. And so a local station would get all these monster movies, and they would put them on television, usually on a Saturday night, Friday night. And a lot of times they'd get a local person to dress up like a ghoul or a vampire, and they would host it, much like you might see on MeTV. Sven Gulli still is doing that in that tradition. He used to be called Son of the Ghoul, and before that there was the Ghoul, and then if you go back far enough there was a guy named Ghoulardi, and so he's kind of the 4th, 5th generation of that. So yes, Vampira was probably the first big famous horror host, but you know, she was really the early 1950s, and there weren't many movies. Hollywood was not real thrilled with this new television, and they hadn't released many monster movies. So a lot of the movies that Vampira showed, she was local LA television. A lot of the movies she showed were more like mystery movies, you know, or very, you know, she wasn't showing Frankenstein and the Wolfman, because those didn't come until 57. I believe it was 57 or 58. I think it was 57 that Universal Pictures were released to television. So kids went crazy for the monsters. They didn't seem old and clunky to the kids because everyone had black and white televisions. So you have these black and white movies, but they don't really take place in modern, Frankenstein, Dracula. They take place in some other time. Doesn't really look like the 1700s. It's probably supposed to be present day if you're watching the original Boris Karloff Frankenstein, but it's set with castles and everything. So in the 50s, those movies were, Frankenstein would have been about 25 years old, but it didn't seem as clunky because everything was in black and white, right? So kids fell, Frankenstein became huge. And Bobby Pickett released a song called The Monster Mash that became a huge hit. He went by Bobby Boris Pickett because he could do this really good Boris Karloff impression, and that's what the Monster Mash is. The Monster Mash might have been more early 60s. Anyway, that monster craze went on for a while. But one of the story behind this magazine, Famous Monsters, James Warren was this wannabe publisher. He wanted to have, he kind of dreamed of being a publisher like Hugh Hefner, and put out a magazine like that, but it only went about 4 issues. There were so many imitations of what Hugh Hefner was doing. He was just one of the imitations. But in one of the issues, there was an agent for writers that approached him that had, he would broker stories to the magazines, named Forrest J. Ackerman. And he was a big science fiction nut and had been since he was a little kid in the 20s with the pulp magazines, and he worshipped Metropolis and King Kong and all that. He was just one of those early science fiction nerds, first generation, right? So he picked up a magazine in France called the Cinema 57 or something, and it was all and it had I think Werewolf of London on the cover, and it was a huge feature on monsters, the old monster movies. And so he showed this, Forrest Ackerman showed this to James Warren, the publisher, and said, look, we should do something like this. So anyway, Famous Monsters came along in the late 50s, capitalized on this explosion of interest in monsters. So Famous Monsters comes out, and it's a magazine all about, and Forrest J. Ackerman had a huge collection of stills from these old movies, and he knew a lot about them, so they put out a magazine where the monsters and the people that played the monsters are glorified. It's like a fan magazine. It's called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And so whereas other magazines might be talking about James Dean or Marilyn Monroe or Marlon Brando or Elvis Presley, they're talking about Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi and Lon Chaney and Willis O'Brien that did the animation in King Kong. And all these 10-year-old kids buying these magazines are learning about these old movies and seeing them on television and learning about the people that made them. And it was done in a humorous way too, I think, to a certain extent, to kind of make the parents not as upset about the magazine. But anyway, it sold, and James Warren's, he was, I don't have a complete collection because I'm not rich. And I wish I had a complete collection, but my earliest issue is the September 62. I think I showed these recently. I'll show them again. Because I do that. I might say some different things this time. It's weird. Their Tales of Terror was shown in my elementary school at night. One night they sold tickets, and it was to raise money for the PTA or something. They got a 16mm print of it, but it was a movie from '62, and I was seeing it about 11, 12 years later. So that's... So James Warren put out this magazine, and he had a mail order company, and about there's about 15 to 20 pages in the back of every issue that's just a catalog of all the monster merchandise that you could get, and so it was called the Captain Company, and I need to do some research. Was James Warren a captain in the Korean War? Is that why he called it the Captain Company? I know he was in the Korean War, and he was big pro-military and everything. And he went with a bunch of World War II soldiers at one point to storm the beach on Normandy and recreate that. I don't know why they'd want to do that, but they went back to Normandy, and he went with them, even though he wasn't a World War II vet. My father was about James Warren's age. James Warren's still alive. My father, unfortunately, isn't. James Warren's in his 90s, and I guess is healthy. But James Warren, he was deafened to a large degree during the Korean War. So he didn't have very good hearing, but he put out he put out these monster magazines, and he was selling the masks, Don Post masks. And this is number 34, by the way. James Warren, that was another copy of the same issue. After this magazine was successful, then he started doing some comic magazines, kind of based on the EC comics from the early 50s that were wildly popular, but were shut down by the Comics Code of Authority, which came in and kind of put the kibosh on horror comics, because the government was starting to crack down on the comics industry, and they just decided, hey, we're going too far. So he started a magazine called Creepy, and he got a lot of the original writers and at least one writer from the old EC comics. Apparently James Warren didn't really like the old EC comics. He thought they were kind of trashy. He was trying to do something more sophisticated. But the EC, he was actually wrong. The EC comics were better than what he did. They were better written and had, the thing that EC had were the surprise endings. And it was just, he could look down them all he wanted, but he was basically doing an imitation. Creepy was great. It sold. Then he put out another magazine called Eerie, and that sold. So he had two horror. And in the early issues, the guy that was the editor of the horror comic magazines, Archie Goodwin, he was told, use classic monsters like werewolves and mummies and Frankenstein type, monsters and vampires. So it'll kind of blend in with this magazine. And he wasn't too thrilled with that. They did that for a while, but then it got into other kinds of monsters and other kinds of horror. The 60s, Creepy and Eerie, used a lot of artists from the old EC days. But as in the 70s, there was a different guy in charge, the editor editing those magazines, and they became more and more artists from Spain. And in 1969 there was a third comic called Blazing Combat that was a war, because EC had the horror comics, they had science fiction comics, but they also had war comics, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. And so they put out Blazing Combat, and they had Frank Frazetta covers and really great artwork. It was also an anti-war comic. It was very realistic. In the 60s, I guess it's the 60s went on, James Warren became soured on the Vietnam War. He was a very patriotic guy, but he thought you shouldn't be fighting a war if you're not in it to actually win. If you're just in it and just kind of halfway doing it, you've got to fight. If you're going to fight a war, you've got to really fight to win and get it over with and not stretch it out to make more money for politicians. So he put some anti-Vietnam editorials in his magazines, and I think that may be why. Well, first time I saw Famous Monsters of Filmland, it was in an army base. It was there in the Base Exchange bookstore in Germany. But I think Blazing Combat only lasted a couple of issues. The Warren comic magazine about war, and I don't think the army bases, I don't think the military bases kept carrying it. But they would sell these 8mm movies. Oh, here's an ad for Blazing Combat. See the Frazetta cover there? I have a feeling I just did this exact same episode a few weeks ago. I have a strange feeling, like everything I'm saying I just said recently, but you know, I've slept since then. Anyway, so 36. Fantastic. Here's another copy of 36. So sometimes I'll buy a book the second time. I don't really realize I'm doing it. But I didn't discover this magazine until about 1969, 1970. So all these were before my time. There was another magazine that started in 1969 called Vampirella. And I'll show you some of those later this episode if I get to it. If not, I'll show them to you next time. Vampirella was started kind of jokey, and then got to be more of a serious comic strip about a vampirist from another planet. And she had this crew that she hung out with. One was a descendant of Van Helsing, and that was her boyfriend. And she was a good character. She was not an evil character. She was like a superhero, basically. And I'll tell you more about that when we get to it. 40th anniversary issue. It's not been around 40 years. It's because it's issue 40. Usually when they say 40th anniversary, it means 40 years, but no. Oh, boy. One thing that made Famous Monsters great was this typeface. It's just something about it, it's perfection. And then the logo, Famous Monsters of Filmland. Frank Zappa used it on an album called that might have been a bootleg Frank Zappa record that had this. It said it was changed to Mothers. And then the Misfits, the punk band, Glenn Danzig's band. He is a big Monster fan. He used that font for the Misfits logo. So this was always just one of the greatest things about growing up in the 70s. This magazine existed. And there were three that were the Trinity, I don't mean to be sacrilegious, that were the top trio of great monster magazines. And not comic magazines, but actual magazines with text stories and photographs of monsters in them. Famous Monsters, of course. There was also another magazine that didn't come out that often called Castle of Frankenstein. I highly recommend that to you. It's not that hard to get a collection of Castle of Frankenstein. It's much easier than this because there weren't as many of them. Castle of Frankenstein, and then I think starting in 71 or 72, there was a tabloid magazine newspaper called the Monster Times, and that was those three are the ones you need to get: Famous Monsters, Castle of Frankenstein, the Monster Times. There's a lot more Monster Times than there are Castle of Frankenstein, because for a while it came out twice a month. Also, it's kind of a delicate magazine because it was printed on newsprint, so you need to try to find good, try to find good copies of it. If they come from hot parts of the country, if it was, it may not, and it was stored in an attic, it may not be much left of it. But definitely look out for those magazines. This is 46. Sometimes here they're experimenting with putting some comic stories into Famous Monsters. This is issue 48. I think that I got this for $5 just a couple of years ago. COVID came along, and they closed up everything. So you'd have to shop at Walmart and Amazon, and once they'd made billions of dollars, they were let people open again, as long as you were, your little diaper. Anyway, Duncanville Books, suburb of Dallas, right next to Oak Cliff. Duncanville and Oak Cliff aren't the best areas to live in, but Duncanville had a great bookstore there. Great comic store. During the shutdown, when the stores couldn't open, Duncanville Books must have gone through their warehouse and priced and put out tons of magazines. A lot of monster magazines, and they put them out for $5 each. And so, when all that nonsense, when they allowed you to open the stores again, I went in there and it was like Christmas morning. I couldn't believe I was filling in a lot of holes in my Famous Monsters collection. That's 49. See this dot? That's how they price their books. It was actually priced at $15, and I think that dot, I don't remember if that means half price, so I probably got this for $7.50, and it's a very good copy. There are very good copies of these magazines out there, and it's because James Warren, when these magazines didn't sell, he had people send the entire magazine back, is what I understand, and there was a warehouse find at some point in the 80s or probably 80s of a lot of these old magazines, because they always had ads, if you remember, in the back of James Warren's magazines where you could order back issues. That means they had stacks and stacks in their warehouse, and they all look brand new. So be aware. If you're asked to pay high prices, and unless it's the very early issues from the late 50s, early 60s, you might want to. Because see, here's another copy. I've got of that same issue, and look, it also looks pretty brand new, doesn't it? But this is from. I was probably learning to walk when this magazine came out. You can obviously see I am old. And I apparently have 3 copies of this, and I apparently got one from Gotham City Comics. See, it's also in very good condition. And I swear one night I was on the phone with Kevin from Gotham City Comics, and he was telling me what Famous Monsters he had, and I was saying, yeah, I've got that one, I don't have that one. And somehow, I don't know, I guess I didn't see that I already have several copies of that Gorgo issue. That's all right. This one, I remember telling you this story. I saw this one as a kid pulling a wagon down the street. He was part of a paper drive for his church or Boy Scouts or something. And this magazine was on top of that stack. And I looked through it, but I remember I should have just pulled it and said, hey, let me keep that. But you couldn't do that because it was a paper drive. But it wasn't in this good a shape. But anyway, I remember seeing the pictures of Barbarella in it. So that's from probably 67, 68. That's issue 51. Here's issue 53. Another copy of 53. This one is also from Duncanville because of the sticker. Looks like they're asking 20. I must have gotten it for 10. But what I didn't know is I already had it. What do we got here? And hey, I bought another copy from Gotham City Comics. That's all right. I used to have a magazine rack back in the old country at my old house, where it was all monster magazines, and in fact, that rack's still in the other room, but I probably should do that again. And I've got multiple copies. I might as well just make it look like heaven, a rack filled with monster magazines. Anyway, this was marked at 20, but I probably got it for 10 because it's half price. I forget the lady that's in, what is that congresswoman that's like 90 years old? She looks just like that. I can't remember her name. I'm not talking about Nancy Pelosi. There's this other woman that looks even worse than Nancy Pelosi. Here's another one. Maybe that'll jog your memory. Here's the model kit, The Forgotten Prisoner of Castlemare. But it was originally marketed as a Famous Monsters of Filmland hobby kit from Aurora. Then they took the Famous Monsters name off of it after a while. There was a movie, it was a Creature from the Black Lagoon kind of knockoff called The Monster from Piedras Blancas. And that's the movie where you always see that still of this cool looking monster holding a head that he's ripped off of someone. They promoted that movie when it came out. It's like, this movie has won the Famous Monsters of Filmland Award for Great Shock Picture. There was no award. They were using the Famous Monsters of Filmland name in an unauthorized way. It was not, they did not have permission to do that, so they had to take that off. This is when Land of the Giants came on television. There was a model kit just like that. Ooh, Tony Tallarico art. Ooh, that's terrible. You could buy a poster with your head in the middle of it with all these monsters around you, but unfortunately the monsters aren't drawn by someone great like Jack Davis, but by Tony Tallarico. I can always tell Tony Tallarico's art. He's like my Lex Luthor. He's like my enemy. 57, the green slime. I have a one sheet to this, which I wish I could get framed, but there's no framing places around here, and I have no money. I mean, literally very poor. And that's why I'm hoping some of you will be buying some episodes of The Tomb of Terror, a great television program that I produce. But will you? I don't know. You have to send $20 postpaid for each episode to PayPal at Kenneth Weinert. That's spelled KENNETHWEINERT. And you put in your address, and I send off whatever episode. I have 32 episodes. About to make a 33rd, but maybe I will. Here's 58. Another great painting. I'm trying to find the first one that I actually saw when I was a kid on the newsstand. Here's number 60. I think we're getting to the point where these are the ones where maybe I first saw them when I was like 4 or 5 on the newsstand. Oh, here's another one. Oh, here's one that is not bagged and boarded of that same issue. So I could kind of show you what it looks like inside. They always sold this Jack Davis poster of Frankenstein. It's like life-size and all these great posters. Bridget Bardot, Spock. That's about the only time Spock appeared in this magazine. There was for some strange reason, Star Trek never got covered in this magazine. Star Trek got covered extensively in the Monster Times and also in Castle Frankenstein. So I don't know what the deal was. There were some other magazines that James Warren tried to do, Screen Thrills Illustrated, one about Western movies, one called Spacemen about space movies. None of those worked except for this one. They thought, well, if we do magazines about other genre movies, maybe that'll work. But and then they tried to do another magazine, a sister magazine to Famous Monsters called Monster World. That's a great cover. It only lasted about 11, 12 issues. But what they did is they were trying to get to issue 100 to have a big 100, issue celebration. So what they did is they jumped. I forget the numbers. Like they jumped from issue 80 to 92, and then they said Monster World is counted as issues of Famous Monsters. I forget exactly. You can look it up, but this later was retconned into being part of the run of Famous Monsters. So I really should have the Monster Worlds in here, and I don't remember if I put them in here or not. I might have them separate. But originally it was a separate magazine that was sold on the stand next to Famous Monsters. So trying to by this point the kits were glow, the model kits, the Aurora monster kits, which I don't know if I mentioned. That was a big part of the monster craze. Okay, here's where Vampirella first started. At this point, they're only on the second issue. They only have 2 issues. Vampirella was this super heroine that was a vampire, and they had her story, and then also other horror stories in the back of that magazine. It says, "Hi there, welcome to the coolest girl meets ghoul mag on the market. My name's Vampirella. I'm the newest thing in comic magazines. If you take me home with you, you can call me Vampy." It really became more serious later on. Maybe about 12 issues in, it became a serious comic strip. The costume was designed by Trina Robbins, the underground comics artist, and then she described the costume to Frank Frazetta on the phone, and Frank Frazetta painted the cover for the first issue of Vampirella from her description on the phone of the costume she designed. Trina Robbins is a great kind of feminist underground comic artist. She's still around. She did a miniseries of Wonder Woman for DC back in the 80s. I think it was like a 4-issue set, and it was very much drawn in the Golden Age style of Wonder Woman. They'd always have these mystery photos where you'd have to guess what this movie is from. Let's see, there's some girl that apparently solved the mystery of some previous issues. And that's Carol Borland, who played Luna in Mark of the Vampire. And she was kind of one of the original, there are all these vamps in the silent movie era that wore their makeup kind of that way, but she was like the first of the vampire girls. And from her, Charles Addams, that did the Addams Family cartoons in the New Yorker, and then that would inspire Vampira, and then the Addams Family TV series, and the Munsters, and Vampirella. Basically all the ghoul women go back to Carol Borland. Although that's the disappointing thing about this movie is you find out at the end they're not really vampires. They're faking it, and that's the only bad thing about this movie, The Mark of the Vampire. It's disappointing, like Scooby-Doo. They always find out at the end that everything's not real. It's not real monsters. Here's Eerie. At this point, they only had 23 issues of Eerie, and that's John Campbell's The Thing. The movie The Thing from Another World was based on a strip. I mean, what am I saying? A novel. But they would, there's John W. Campbell. They would give lots of coverage to Ray Harryhausen, the stop motion animator, and that was that was something the kids loved, is to find out more about how these movies were made. Okay, here's issue 62. Let's see where we're at. I mean, obviously we're in the very late 60s because they've got Spock on in the ads. February 1970. Yeah, by then I was living in Germany on an army base. These are the magazines that I would have been seeing. And I'd always marvel at them, and I would ask my mother, "Can I buy that?" And she would just say no, or sometimes she'd flip through it and then say no. And I had the same problem with Mad and Cracked, and sometimes she would let me buy those. She'd let me buy Cracked. Mad, sometimes. Cracked, I think she determined was harmless by flipping through it. This magazine, she did not like me having this, and she I don't think she said I shouldn't buy these until I was like 12 or 10. I don't remember. It always seemed like some impossible age so far from now. I think it was 12. But then by the time I was 12, I couldn't find them. No, it must have been younger. Maybe she said till you're 10. Anyway, but then I couldn't find the magazines where I was living at that point. This is 63. We're about to get to some great covers. 64, I definitely remember this when I was a kid. That's from House of Wax. And I saw that movie in 3D when it was re-released in the late 70s. That was quite fun. Here's 65. And they had selling these great Flash Gordon. All comic art, all great superhero art goes back to this artist, Alex Raymond. This is where, Jack Kirby got it. This is where everyone got it, Alex Raymond. All right, see this woman here in the movie The Old Dark House, a movie that was very inspirational to Charles Addams, the cartoonist. This lady here, you've seen a movie with her, that the old lady in Titanic. That's her. She hadn't been in movies in decades and decades, and James Cameron got her to come back and be in that movie. How about that? All right. Here's a great cover. I was like, well, why didn't your mom let you buy those magazines? Gee, I wonder why. I think it's like, why my mom was so mean. Oh, come on. Here's issue 68 with the Mysterious Island. That's the actual silent movie version of Mysterious Island. 69. London After Midnight, which is still a lost movie. A lot of silent movies are lost. Sometimes a country gets opened up that's been shut down to the West for a long time. Like, let's say that everything got cool with Cuba, and all of a sudden, and then it might be that someone still had a print of London After Midnight there, but as far as we know, there are no existing copies of that. Because the silent movies, they didn't need to be dubbed. You just need to change the title cards. They could play anywhere because they didn't have words. I mean, so sometimes those movies might still exist in some collection in the back of some warehouse. But, like almost all of Theda Bara's movies are lost. And that's just 100 years ago. And she was one of the biggest stars in the country, and all her movies are gone. Isn't that wild? And you just think, well, gosh, in 1,000 years, I'm building this collection of fame. All of this is going to be gone because it's made of paper. It's like, look at what's left of the Egyptian civilization. Some pyramids. And, giant things, it's like, the houses we're in, the Hotel Orloff, everything will be gone, except for gigantic structures like maybe Mount Rushmore or something. What will be left of our civilization? I guess it doesn't matter. Unless we're getting reincarnated, you don't want to come back to a bunch of junk. 81. Oh, okay. My friend Tom Ranoni used to own this painting. I've seen this painting like right in front of me, like right like this. And it wasn't much bigger than the way it's printed here. One thing I'll tell you is the guy with the fez was on the other side. They flipped this painting. This is the mirror image of the original painting. I guess because they wanted the text on the back of the guy there on the right. I don't know, but this is I've seen the painting. Basil Gogos. My friend Tom used to have several Basil Gogos. And for a while, he didn't really have a place to stay, but he had all these warehouses filled with his stuff. And he put stuff in my garage and in a little pinball room in my garage. And on top of one of my pinball machines was the entire story from Vault of Horror. He had the entire story of the original art. You're going to ask what artist. It wasn't one, I think it was Kriegstein. It wasn't like Wally Wood or, Graham Ingalls. It wasn't like, or I would have remembered that I actually had something that Wally Wood had touched in my house. It was amazing, though, to see that original art. It's something I could never afford. He went off and worked in Hollywood and then escaped back to Texas and came back with a huge collection of memorabilia and everything, which I guess his family's kept. He passed away. I remember seeing this cover, September of 1971. I mean, that cover just blew me away. Look at that. And then Aurora started selling these torture chamber model kits around that time. And Vampirella was one of the model kits they made, but it did not look like that. Not at all. But there was some controversy about Aurora making those model kits. And so they shut it down because they were selling their whole operation to Nabisco. Why a company that makes crackers and cookies wanted to buy a model kit company, I don't know. But anyway, they've redone those kits about 10, 15 years ago. January 72, Night of Dark Shadows. This is the second of the Dark Shadows feature films. It's not as directly related to the soap opera as the first one. Oh boy. March 72. Dracula versus Frankenstein. This movie's pretty funny. Okay, what is going on here? This is a issue of Famous Monsters with the logo gone. So maybe they could return them by... maybe you could return, you get your money back by turning in not just the whole magazine, but the title strip. They must have just saved a lot of the issues. They must have printed more and kept them in their warehouse. That's why these perfect condition copies became available about maybe 8 years after Warren went under. James Warren had some... I don't know if it was physical issues or depression. Something happened where he kind of lost everything. And I guess it was sold by the bank, all his magazines, everything. And he still must retain some rights to something, because I think he sued for this. There's a company now called Warrant that even kind of imitates his name, Warren. And they call it Warrant, and they put out a magazine called The Creeps that was made to be like Creepy, but it was only one letter different from Creepy. So I believe James Warren sent somehow a cease and desist letter came out. So then they changed the magazine's name to Shutter, which is what it's now being published under. I think that's what happened. There's a biography of James Warren that I'm anxious to read, and it's in my hold pile in Mesa, Arizona at Gotham City Comics. And as soon as I muster up money, I'm going to be sending him a payment, possibly tomorrow. This is a great cover, and get some of the stuff from my hold pile. That was a movie, Frogs. It's just this cover blew my mind. This is a repainted version of the movie poster for that movie. November 72. Yeah, these were coming out once we'd moved from Germany to Hampton, Virginia. Because I remember November of 72, that would have been the middle of my second grade year. And I remember being in Hampton when I saw that frog cover with the hand sticking out of the mouth. I definitely remember that. And I remember this beautiful cover here, which is, this is January 73. And this is when they were selling the Vampirella 6-foot poster, which my cat Pete shredded. I had an original, but Pete accidentally closed the door to a room that while I was at work, and that poster was on the inside of the door when you closed it, and Pete freaked out trying to get out and started clawing until he pulled the poster down and clawed it up. So when I got home from work, I could barely open the door because Pete was panicking and pushing the other way on the other side. It was like an Edgar Allan Poe trauma. Oh, another copy of the same issue. That was years ago, man. That was before I met my wife. That was back. Pete's been around forever. He wrote the very first song. I think I've had Pete since 2000, maybe 2007. Or was it 2008? He's getting up there in age. He's like 15, 16 years old. He came to my door. It was cold outside. I opened the door. He just walked in. It's like, heck with that. I'm moving in. I'm your new roommate. And I had another cat at the time called Princess. That was my very first pet I ever had. Oh, the last time I did this, let's see if I can do it again. Sure, I can get a thumbnail. Gotta line up everything. Yeah, you gotta be old and ugly to fit in with these two. March 73. Still in second grade. A second grade boy should be attracted to books like this. Asylum was a great movie, Robert Bloch. There are kids that didn't like this magazine. I can't understand that. How are you a little boy and you're not into this? How does that not attract? Well, it's pink. Maybe girls would be attracted to that cover. But... Oh, magnificent. July of 73. This is when we were moving to Texas. Oh man, that kind of works too, doesn't it? Let's see.
Trigger warning. This broadcast contains subject matter that might trigger liberal snowflakes. It's the War Room with Owen Schroyer.
This is July of 73. Issue number 99. And then the big issue 100.
Broad daylight, and then hundreds of onlookers just sitting there in amazement filming as the car drives away after the successful smash.
101. This is always kind of weird that Captain Marvel's on the cover, but you got a bunch of issues of Famous Monsters in the back, and some Blast from the Past on the back. This is number 101 from September of '73, right when I was starting my 7th grade year. It's Captain Marvel versus the Mysterious Scorpion. The Captain Marvel cereal was great, and they really did a good job of making him look like he was flying. They had a dummy on a wire, and it looked surprisingly great. His name's Captain Marvel, not Shazam. Just trust me on that.
You mean you commies, you dirtbags, you liars at MSNBC that talk about our
All right.
family legacy? Two of his family members.
Who I could certainly use for I could certainly use for an upgrade. I could certainly use an upgrade for issue 102. It's got a spine roll.
Fascism, and then you're going to attack him because he's
Oh my gosh, look at that mask.
You're sick freaks over there on the left. You are truly disgusting, demented people, aren't you?
Here's 104.
Actually, it's his stand.
It was during this time that I lived in San Antonio, 3rd and 4th grade. It was very hard to find Famous Monsters on the stands. I only saw it.
You're going to have to steal the nomination.
I saw Creepy, Eerie a couple of times. It wasn't that it wasn't carried in San Antonio. It just wasn't at the stores that my mom went. There's another copy, 104. Now, I bought these all later. Now this issue, I traded with a friend to get this one because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Because he found it somewhere in San Antonio. His parents must have shopped at better stores, high quality stores that carried high quality. Another copy of this is one I bought later.